on the Trilateral Summit, I'm joined by Dan McClory, live from Irvine, California. He's the Managing Director and Head of China for Bousted Securities. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Rachelle.
Now, summits bringing the three countries together were originally planned as an annual event, but the most recent one was held in 2015. So talk about the timing of holding this trilateral meeting at this point in time.
Well, not only is it significant because it's the first one, as you point out, in 2.5 years, but it's sort of sandwiched in between the North and South Korean summit and then this pending meeting between North Korea and the U.S. So it was done at a very important interval, and I think it was absolutely correct for these three major nations, major trading partners, to kind of get their wires in coordination and to make sure that they had a shared vision of where they want to take things and that they're somewhat in alignment as we head into this really critical period that, as we've just heard from our correspondent, may actually be in Singapore in June when Trump sits down to put together the deal with North Korea.
So talk a little bit about the main priorities for each country going into these meetings.
You know, it's hard to look past the two major issues that dominated, which is what we just spoke about, which is the relationship with North Korea and denuclearization. And if you want to look at the comparison of the positions, I guess I would generalize and I would say Japan somewhat hardline in those negotiations in terms of their attitude towards North Korea. South Korea just kind of wants to have peace and get a deal done. And China, because of the proximity and the existing trade relationships, wants to make sure that they continue to have influence in the entire Korean peninsula. So they're really coming at it from three different points of view. If we shift over to the economic side of things, and we talk about not just the trilateral trade agreement, and something that Mr. Xi, not Mr. Lee, but Mr. Xi actually calls a community of common destiny, which is a pretty eloquent way of referring to getting everyone together, a community of common destiny, you would see that there are a number of ways that these countries need to cooperate. RCEP is one. But interestingly enough, Mr. Lee has taken the lead in the economic conversations, and he's really capitalized on the fact that China is now at the forefront of being multilateral, globalist, free trade advocating. And it's a little bit ironic, Rachelle, that I think they have Donald Trump to thank for somewhat bringing them together, because his hardline approach in the region is what has caused those countries to say, hey, despite our frosty relationships and differences and not meeting for almost 3 years, we got to get it together.
So then, given the U.S.-China trade tensions, what sort of impetus does that give for a free trade agreement between China, Japan, and South Korea, you think?
A lot of impetus. Absolutely a lot of impetus. Remember, both Japan and China have been hit with tariffs on steel already from the U.S. So they're sort of commonly trying to figure out how do we react and respond to that. But pulling together under RCEP, pulling together under what Mr. Lee called for a trilateral economic union is especially relevant today when you have the U.S. taking its nationalist positions and somewhat bailing out of other agreements, all consistent with Trump's election pledges and the things he told the country that he was going to do before he took office. So I think it's really created a very unique impetus for these countries to come together with shared concerns and a shared ability to affect and have a positive impact on the future.
Now, speaking of trade, let's talk about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, better known as RCEP. Given that these countries are involved, it's ASEAN, plus, of course, India, China, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. What do you think a separate free trade agreement that's just between China, Japan, and South Korea would bring to the table that RCEP doesn't?
Well, you pointed out how far-reaching RCEP or RCEP is with, the ASEAN countries, about 10 of them, Australia and India. That's a massive group. That might be, analogous almost to the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think you've got all levels and types of countries. But as I mentioned earlier, with this trilateral summit with South Korea, China, and Japan, you really have the out-and-out leaders in that region, not just with economic commonality, but also geopolitical commonality. And I think it's both that's pulling them together. But there's a wide range of interest amongst that group of countries that you mentioned, Rachelle. I think what they're going to firmly put on the table is that in this environment of some might say isolationism or nationalism or bailing out of trade agreements, that now is the time to pull these agreements to the fore, and multilateralism is the way that those RCEP countries as well as the TPP countries see the world.
All right, thank you as always for your insights. Dan McClory there, Managing Director and Head of China for Bousted Securities.